So you're making the greatest piece of art that you've ever made in your 3 years of art school, and your friend comes up behind you and says, you should add some red there. And you say, okay, yeah, that's not a bad idea. I'll just click red and then, no, different red. Not that red. And you turn and look at him and you say, so not red? And he turns and looks at you and says, what? And so you, being a professionally educated art student, open up God's greatest gift to man, Photoshop, and bring up that big beautiful color wheel and say, what red are you talking about then? And like a drunk man playing darts, he hits a color that is so not red. You look at him as confused as someone trying to plug headphones into an iPhone 7. And he looks back at you, just as confused. And you look at him and you say, that's not red. And he says, well, who decided that that's red and that's not? Well, I'll be damned. That'd be a good idea for a video. So this is red, yeah? But what if I do this? Is that not red? It still looks red. If I didn't have them right next to each other, could you even tell the difference? No. So who sat on a throne and declared that this, not this, not this, not this, but this was red? Maybe it was whatever red came first, and we all just said that that's red? Well, this stuff is called okra? No. 1 second. Here we go. Good old Wikipedia, source for all completely true human knowledge. Ochre. So this is ochre. It's the first pigment that we ever used, and depending on how hydrated the iron oxide is, it can either be yellow or red or brown or somewhere in between. 45,000 years ago, our ancient ancestors were literally covering themselves in colored dirt, and we're only so lucky that one of them looked at the wall and said, I could paint like a horse or a cow or something. And so for thousands and thousands of years, that was the closest thing anybody had to pigment, let alone the closest thing anybody had to red. But then humans started getting all smart, what with their river valleys and complex languages and increased brain matter. All over the world, red started to appear that didn't look like dried excrement. A bunch of Indians realized that if they crushed the roots of a particular plant, they could use it to dye fabric red. A bunch of Greeks found some red rocks made of mercury and decided to turn it into frescoes. But the real revolution came when some genius Aztec man stepped on one of these little fuckers one day and noticed that it left behind reddish dust, and when you mix that dust with water, well, holy shit, we're actually getting somewhere. That looks like real red. And so the Aztecs spent a couple hundred years using this red to create all sorts of incredible arts and architecture that we're barely even appreciating to this day. And then the conquistadors landed. And, well, yeah. And so the Spanish, after destroying an entire way of life, came back to Europe and said, hey guys, we found this really cool red bug, and I bet it would make really good paint if any of you wanted to try it. And suddenly everybody was smearing bug juice on canvases, from Durer to Rembrandt to Chinese pottery to Jello, except for Vermeer, who said no to the red bug and yes to India's red roots. And good job, Vermeer, because you apparently saw the future and realized that a couple hundred years later, 2 German scientists would eventually create a synthetic red pigment based on the madder root that you loved so much, which is now the pigment used in virtually every single thing around you that is the color red. So that's an incredibly brief and probably incorrect history of red pigment, but unless I'm taking oil paint to my computer monitor, it doesn't exactly answer the question that I had at the beginning. And to do that, we're going to have to talk about computers and light and physics and copyright. Every single modern screen has these little things called pixels, and they're almost always red, green, and blue. The theory goes that by varying the amounts of brightness of those 3 colors, you can recreate any other color that the human eye can see. So that's it then. That is red. We just have to figure out who invented that, and then we're good to go, right? Well, of course not. It's way more complicated than that. So after a few hundred years, we started to get really clever and understand the properties of light itself. Eventually, we used more science to figure out exactly what wavelengths of light correspond to the colors that we can see and develop this lovely little graph that you might remember from science in the 8th grade. People obviously wanted to take this new understanding of light and pigment and turn it into something reproducible on a full color display so that we can browse Tinder in full color. Okay, so we have pixels, little bits of red, blue, and green. Somebody, somewhere, must have decided what color they are, right? Well, boys and girls, it's time for a new segment that I like to call Competing Standards of Giant Corporations Make Everything Worse. It turns out that there is no technical definition of red. There are a spectrum of wavelengths that are red, but none of them is the definition of red, and therefore, if you ask a dozen companies that make electronics and software what red is, you'll get more than one answer, because at the end of the day, it comes down to that company's personal preference. There are, thankfully, a few standards that have been agreed upon upon, the most popular of which is called sRGB. And because sRGB uses an 8-bit color space, the maximum value that it is able to express is 2 to the power of 8, or 256. But because one of those needs to be off, you end up with 255 possible variations of either red, green, or blue within the sRGB standard. It turns out that Adobe has their own color space, which has a larger number of possible colors and uses math that I don't understand in the least. But the red in Photoshop is technically a different red than the red in Paint. However, my computer monitor is going to interpret them as the same red. It's going to interpret both of them as 255. So it ends up not really mattering because my computer is going to reinterpret Photoshop's color space into sRGB anyway. And to add another layer of complication, every single company that makes things with screens renders color just a little bit differently. So somewhere in that sea of boredom is our answer. Red is defined as a part of the visible spectrum of light, and the red that became the red is arbitrarily chosen from those possible variations for the purpose of mixing the best with an arbitrarily picked green and an arbitrarily picked blue to create as many colors as possible. But depending on which red, green, and blue are chosen, the colors that they generate are going to be different. And sometimes companies agree on those colors, and sometimes they don't. You can try and calibrate every single screen in your life in some feeble attempt to gain some form of standardization, but once it goes onto another person's screen, it's game over because they will see a different red. Who decided that red is red? The answer is no one. No one decided what red is red. Nobody has decided what red is red. And unless every single company in the world comes together and sings Kumbaya, we're not going to have a red that is red. Jesus Christ, that ended sad. That wasn't funny at all towards the end.